You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is the crazy Victorian poisoning mystery. Now, this is a case that happened a long time ago. Now, this mystery is one that will leave you confused, frustrated, but nonetheless intrigued. So let's go back in history and see what we can uncover. By the way, I post content like this all the time. It's my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean absolutely no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if you would like to support me in that, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed, give this video a thumbs up, and leave a nice comment down below. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1886 in London, and the Bartlett family lived in a place called Pimlico, and this was Thomas Edwin and his wife Adelaide Blanche, and together they had been married for 11 years. They did not have any kids, and this was not the normal marriage that everybody expects at all. In fact, Thomas was born in London in 1845 and was the son of a builder who knew how to work hard at quite a young age, and by the time he was an adult, he had actually opened up several grocery stores around the country, and it had gained him a decent amount of wealth. When he was 30 years old, he would come across this beautiful young woman who was French, and she was actually at Thomas's brother's house, and that is when they would meet, and he set his eyes upon her and said that she was the woman he was going to marry. He was going to do whatever it took. The only problem was they were 11 years apart in age. This meant that when he was 30 and settled and a businessman, she was only 19 and was still figuring herself out. You see, Adelaide was born in France on December 19th of 1855 to Clara Chamberlain, and this was her mother, who was not thought to have a husband at this time, and back then that was so unheard of to have a child out of wedlock. But nobody really knew who Adelaide's father was. You see, there were rumors floating about that her father was this wealthy socialite and quite a big name in the public eye, but these rumors were never confirmed. And this father figure was said to be quite a prominent figure in Adelaide's life. He actually often went to visit her or had her come visit him, but nobody really knew his name. He was completely unknown to the public. Now, many theorized that it could be Adolphe Tremoli, who was a member of the Queen Victoria's entourage and had actually been traveling to France when Adelaide would have been conceived, and because of these dates matching up, people thought maybe it could be him because he would have some power and possibly would want to keep it out of the news and the media, but nobody really knows for sure. Adelaide and her father had a decent relationship, as much as you can have one with a hidden parent, but Adelaide still lived with her mother Clara during this time, and this was definitely a very grounding environment compared to what her father would bring her into, such a, rich and definitely different sort of lifestyle. So at home with Clara, she had such a calm, normal family. But this would all change in 1966 when Adelaide was 11 years old and her mother would pass away. Now, it's not said why her father didn't take her in, but I'm assuming that was because the world would know if Adelaide moved in with him who he was. So Adelaide actually had to go to her mother's brother, and this would be her aunt and uncle, and she would begin to live with them, although she would then have to move from where she knew, where she had grown up in France, all the way to London. These two were named William and Anne Well-Beloved, and they brought her into their world in London and, gave her a good education and gave her a roof over her head and loved her. And the only problem was Adelaide had grown up the first 11 years of her life in a completely different place. So she had to try really hard to fit in. They gave her a good education. She was extremely intelligent and graceful, and she had beautiful looks to match it. And By the time she was 18, she would be at the Bartlett's home, Thomas Edwin's brother's home, and that is where she would meet Thomas, and the two would quickly fall together. Now, it's speculated that her new father, which was really her uncle William, was the one who kind of forced Adelaide into marrying wealthy, and that possibly he had even set her up with the Bartletts, as though it was her destiny and her purpose to marry a wealthy man. But the strange thing was, Adelaide really didn't seem to put up a fight when Thomas decided he was going to marry her, and so that is exactly what they did. Adelaide's father, I'm pretty sure this is her birth father, that nobody knows who he is, gave Thomas a large sum of money, which is a dowry, to marry, and so they were legally married on April 6th of 1875. But Adelaide hadn't ever finished her education, and Thomas didn't really like this. He didn't approve. So he told her she needed to go back and she needed to finish, because a wife without a proper education, that was horrific in his eyes. So Adelaide would be sent to a boarding school for the next 2 years, and after that she would go to a finishing school. That way she could polish up her appearance and her personality to be the proper wealthy wife. Now, some say that this was all Thomas is doing, that he really did just train her to be this perfect woman that he wanted. Although others say that this was actually in the marriage contract, and that Adelaide's father had put these into this contract, saying that Thomas would take sole responsibility of Adelaide and would never refer to her past at all and would do anything she asked, and that this was more Adelaide's choice to go to all these schools and to live a more normal lifestyle in her 20s. 3 years later, Adelaide would move into the shop that Thomas owned. There was an apartment above this grocery store, and that is where they lived together. And it was said that Thomas Edwin was extremely hardworking. He was ambitious, and he was a reasonably good-looking man. And it wasn't like, you know, Adelaide had married this 80-year-old ugly man who was near death, and that was that. It was, you know, they were 11 years apart. It was more that Thomas wanted to marry her, then they had fallen in love, and then wanted to get married, which is strange in itself, but it wasn't that odd for the time, unfortunately. But what was strange was that Adelaide and Thomas's relationship was said to be strictly platonic, meaning there was no sort of romance at all. So they were living more like friends, or even brother and sister, than a married couple. Now, this was said to be because Thomas believed that every marriage was supposed to have 2 spouses. One that you could have a platonic companionship with and basically be friends, and the other was for a romantic adoration and, you know, the sexual activity. However, he didn't have anyone else for sexual activity that we know of. It was believed that back in these Victorian times that women did not have any sort of sexual feelings at all. So it didn't matter that her husband didn't want to do anything with her, because she didn't have those anyway. However, Thomas did really feel for Adelaide, loved her like a sister, and in fact, she was in his will as getting all of his money whenever he died, as long as she didn't remarry. He had a sort of obsession with the control over her and did not want any other man near her. And this would come into the story later on as a very important fact. Adelaide was a good wife and did as Thomas wanted her to. He was often away at work though, and would leave her home alone, and she didn't really have any friends. And the problem was, Thomas and Adelaide lived with Thomas's father, who was Edwin Sr. And Edwin had never really liked Adelaide. Nobody was really sure why this was, other than that Thomas was no longer giving him all of the attention. He was giving Adelaide the attention instead, and his father wanted that all to himself, because Thomas's father had just lost his wife and Thomas had just lost his mother, and this was said to really make Edwin Sr. kind of attached to his son in a way that was far too much for anyone to be able to handle. So he was living with them and he really didn't like Adelaide. And so one day he decided to go to Thomas and say, look, I really need to talk to you. It's something urgent. And that is when he would say that he had found that Adelaide and Thomas's younger brother were having an affair. His name was Frederick. And Thomas didn't believe this for 1 minute. In fact, he took Adelaide's side, and Adelaide was completely shocked at this accusation as well. And Edwin was basically told if he wanted to stay with them, if he wanted to be able to live anywhere near them, he had to not only apologize, but go down and make a formal apology in front of a lawyer saying that he was mistaken. And he actually ended up doing so. Some speculate that Edwin Sr. wasn't lying, that this wasn't some vicious way to get back at his daughter-in-law, that he had seen something that he needed to tell his son about, and that there was an affair happening because Frederick would soon after this move to America, a completely different country, and it was rumored that him and Adelaide actually still kept in contact. Now, it was 4 years later, it was now 1881, and Adelaide was pregnant. But how, if her husband didn't want to even touch her? Well, this contract had forbade them from being intimate whatsoever. However, when Adelaide began to talk about wanting a child, Thomas decided to break this contract only one time, and they would be intimate once. And if they got pregnant, then of course that would be wonderful, and Adelaide could finally have her child. This dream of hers was getting closer. She was closer to her due date, and they hired a nurse who would come over and constantly be with her. Her name was Annie Walker, and she was a very good nurse, and Annie was trying to prepare for the birth, and she told Adelaide and Thomas, this is going to be a painful and rough birth. You need to have a doctor here just to make sure that everything is going to go okay. But Thomas said, absolutely not. He said he didn't want any man touching his wife's body. So he refused to call a doctor. So the day came, and Adelaide was getting closer and closer to giving birth, and no doctor was present. Of course, Annie was there, but she wasn't fully trained in what to do or how to stop her from having so much pain, and she was screaming, she was crying, and she was begging Thomas to call a doctor. And finally he did, but it would be too late. When the doctor got there, he saved Adelaide before she passed away, but he could not save the child. It was a stillborn. Now, this took such a toll on Adelaide mentally that she said she never wanted to try for another kid again. She didn't want a kid. She was not going to be pregnant again, even though this was one of her biggest goals before this. And I'm not sure if there was any sort of resentment to Thomas on her end, because at this time females were told not to cause a scene, not to argue with males, to pretty much sit and look pretty, and that if they had something to say, that basically they needed to keep it in, because a man was to be respected, even if he didn't deserve it, and even if a female disagreed. So I'm sure Adelaide didn't really feel she had the option to speak out or to be angry at her husband. 2 years later, the couple would move to a place in Merton Abbey, and this was supposed to be a fresh start for the two of them. At this time, Adelaide was 29, Thomas was 41, but this new start would not be in favor of this couple. You see, the two began to make friends in the community, and they were really getting out and knowing people and letting them into their personal life, and one of which was a 27-year-old pastor named George Dyson, and he got along with him so well. He was constantly coming over. They were going over to see him. They were always hanging out, and the odd thing was both Adelaide and Thomas liked him just as much. Every single one of them got along, and Thomas actually liked him so much that he made George the executor of his will, and he also asked if he would tutor Adelaide in all of the classics and help her to learn even more. And the two actually had a nickname for him, Georgius Rex. And you only really give nicknames like that to people you're really comfortable with. Adelaide was finally seeing the light again. She believed things were looking up, and of course, when you leave two people alone who get along really well, sometimes feelings start to brew, and that's what was happening during these tutor sessions when Thomas was at work and George and Adelaide were hanging out together. George would even write her poetry saying, "Who is it that hath burst the door, unclosed the heart that shut before, and set her queen-like on its throne, and made its homage all her own, my birdie?" And apparently birdie is what he would call Adelaide. Of course, this was not good. Adelaide was still married, and beyond that, she had a husband that wouldn't even let her doctor touch her during her labor. And this is where you believe things would start to get dark, right? Actually, no. That is not what occurred, because Adelaide's husband decided he liked George just as much and that their relationship was okay. Like I told you before, he believed there was supposed to be two wives that a man had, one for friendship and one for sexual intimacy. But now he decided that basically his wife was going to get that instead of him. There was also a bit of a romance going on between Thomas and George too. Thomas would write George letters saying, "Who could help loving you?" So they would all hang out quite often, and this was not a short fling. This lasted for years. Adelaide and Thomas would then move into another flat in Pimlico, and they would still be seeing George all of the time. And this was when things started to get even more strange, because Thomas decided he loved the idea of his wife with this pastor and that George could be a co-husband. But do you remember that part in his will that said that Adelaide could not remarry if she wanted the money? At this point, he would also take that out and say that she could remarry. She could remarry George. Thomas had also bought George a season train ticket so he could come and see them whenever he wanted. At this point, Adelaide and George were kissing in front of Thomas, and he almost liked it. He was excited about it. This was a complete 180 to when he wouldn't let a doctor in the room. Now, something I haven't told you is why Thomas was so worried about his will and dying. He was only in his 40s after all. His constant fear of it came from the fact that he was thought to be a hypochondriac. If you don't know what that is, it's an intense fear or anxiety of death or of illness. So much so that it consumes you, where you have to go to the doctor and get tests and go to the emergency room for people to make sure that you are not dying, because in your head that's how you feel, or that you have a certain illness. You cannot control how you feel about it. There is just a paranoia about it. This is something that a lot of people can find annoying, but it's an intense fear that overtakes them, and they also have a fear of people not believing them, so that's why they want to go get the tests, because they are certain that this is happening, and a lot of the times it's not, but they're worried that that one time they were right, they're gonna die because they didn't go to the doctor. And this is said to be exactly how Thomas felt. Adelaide even said that he had a mysterious internal complaint for years, and that a lot of the times people couldn't find out what was wrong with him, even though he said there was so much wrong. Thomas said that he would die within the year, even though doctors hadn't said this to him. It was just something that he believed, and his teeth were also said to be decaying out of his mouth, and this was causing so much pain. And the problem was he had gone to a dentist, and instead of pulling the teeth to get rid of the pain, this dentist sawed down his teeth so he could put dentures in, but he didn't pull them out. So that pain was still there under his dentures, and it got no better at all. Adelaide was then giving him small doses of chloroform before bed because the pain would not allow him to sleep unless he was basically knocked out. So it was pretty normal in 1855, when Adelaide had asked George to run to the store and get the chloroform that Dr. Alfred Leach had prescribed. And so George came back with small bottles and put them all into one, and Adelaide was said to use it from there. Later that year, Thomas's health was quickly deteriorating, and Dr. Leach was summoned to their house. This was when it was found he was suffering from indigestion believed to be from mercury poisoning. How is this possible, you may be asking? Well, Thomas had been taking mercury as a cure for his syphilis, which, if you don't know, is a bacterial infection spread by sexual contact and can start as painless sores in places such as your mouth. So he was taking this to try to cure it. But the doctor would find that he didn't have syphilis at all, that he had been curing something he did not have. And basically this doctor said, it's just the teeth in your mouth that are causing this pain, and go to the dentist. So he went to another dentist to get his teeth properly pulled out, and the pain finally relieved itself for a while. But Thomas continued to feel as though something else was wrong with him, and Adelaide said she often didn't sleep because she had to sit right next to Thomas and make sure he didn't walk about the room like a ghost, and she would have to sit there and hold his toe. That was the only way he would go to sleep. This is when Adelaide asked Dr. Leach to bring in another doctor for a second opinion. Why would she say this? Well, she said if Thomas didn't get better soon, his friends were going to accuse her of poisoning him. When the new doctor, Dr. Dudley, arrived, he said nothing was wrong with Thomas, that he was suffering more mentally than anything with depression and sleeplessness, and needed to take walks and stop obsessing over his health, but that other than that, nothing was wrong. But the first doctor, Dr. Leach, actually disagreed with this diagnosis and said that Thomas was suffering from worms and started to give him laxatives to help with that in large doses. And after this, during December of that year, Thomas actually looked like he was getting better. He was up and he was doing things for the first time in what seemed like forever. However, in the early hours of January 1st, 1866, Adelaide would run out of her bedroom that she slept in with Thomas, and she would scream for the landlord to come. It was 4 a.m. and she told them to fetch a doctor. When they went into the bedroom, they found that Thomas was lying face down on a bed next to the fire, and his body was already cold. Adelaide told everyone that she had fallen asleep holding his toe like she always did, and when she woke up he was lying face down, and so she tried to flip him over, and when he didn't do anything or wake up, that's when she tried to pour brandy, alcohol, down his throat. But this didn't wake him up either, and he was already gone. It was concluded that Thomas had died several hours earlier, but was this an accident? Was this a suicide? Was this death from natural causes? Or was this murder? Well, many started to suspect Adelaide. It would be found that 6 days prior to this, Adelaide had asked George to fetch her some more chloroform, and when he said, why can't Dr. Leach just bring it to her, she basically explained that Dr. Leach wouldn't give her any. She said, he does not know that I am skilled in drugs and medicine, and not knowing that, he would not entrust me with it. George actually went to buy some chloroform from local chemists, but had to lie to them saying that it was to get out some grease stains, and these small bottles had to be bought from different stores, because if you bought a full bottle, you had to put it down in chemist books at the pharmacy to record buying these medical poisons in large doses. So instead, he bought these small ones and many different ones, and then it didn't have to be recorded. When Thomas passed, George immediately went to the police and said, look, I did this and I know it looks suspicious, but I promise I didn't know. I don't know what she did or what she could have done. Now, Dr. Leach also came forward hearing this side of Adelaide's story, that Dr. Leach had been the one to prescribe this chloroform, and he said that he didn't want to prescribe it to her in the beginning, but she insisted, and she told him it was to resist Thomas's sexual actions against her, and she was going to put it on a towel and put it over his face to make him fall asleep. 2 days before Thomas's death, everyone had said that he was doing so much better in regards to his health. Dr. Leach had said, I don't think you need me anymore, and he was really excited about this, but he did have a dentist appointment the next day, and he asked Dr. Leach to go with him in Adelaide. So the three of them went, and everything went extremely well. Everyone was in good spirits, and when they separated, everyone was really excited. Adelaide was actually there, and she had been having small talk with Dr. Leach. She was saying basically that her and Thomas often joked that they wish they had never gotten married. That way they could experience that again and like get married again. They went back home that evening and Thomas was still feeling good. In fact, he ate dinner with the whole family and they had such a large meal with fruitcake. Everyone was happy. And then when they were going up to bed, Thomas actually asked the maid if the next morning they could have haddock for breakfast, and that if she promised him that, he would make sure to get up an hour earlier because of it. And he was really looking forward to the next day, but he wouldn't make it to breakfast. By 11:30, the couple was snuggled together in bed, and 5 hours later, he was deceased. Adelaide was asked if he could have possibly taken any poisons, and she said no, that she would have woken up, she would have noticed if he had done so, and she did not have any knowledge of it. An autopsy was then done by 5 doctors, and Adelaide thought this was a wonderful idea because they all wanted to know what had happened. When they opened him up, they would find a stomach full of chloroform. Adelaide insisted that although she sometimes gave it to him to go to sleep, she hadn't even given him any that night because he was doing so well and wasn't in pain. But her landlord begged to differ, because the landlord said when she woke him up, he went into the room and he had seen a wine glass that was 3/4 full of liquid on the mantle, and it smelled like brandy and chloroform. There was no bottle of chloroform anywhere around in the room that the landlord could see, and at this point they knew Thomas had died of chloroform poisoning, and his father was insisting that Adelaide had murdered him. Edwin Sr. would be on top of her at every single point in this investigation. In fact, when the police said she needed to leave her apartment, go stay somewhere else so they could make it a crime scene and search it, he checked her pockets before she left, making sure she didn't take anything with her. George at this point would also come forward saying Adelaide didn't want him to tell police that he had bought the chloroform for her, and Adelaide was very defensive of this whole thing, and George was asking her what she did with the chloroform, and she was basically saying that it was still in the bottle that he gave her. She never used it. George said that she basically threatened him, saying that she would incriminate him if he turned her over. Of course, at this point, George and Adelaide's relationship was over too. Now you might be thinking at this point, that's it. Story's over, Adelaide did it. But there was still one question that couldn't be answered. And that was, how in the world did this poison get inside Thomas's stomach? Because it wasn't that simple. You see, it's impossible to swallow chloroform without it leaving blisters in your throat. And there wasn't any present on Thomas, so how did it get inside of him? That's what no one could figure out. If this was murder, how did Adelaide do it? Well, when Adelaide was interviewed, all she would say was that she wished more than anything chloroform hadn't been found. She also started going into what her married life was like, saying that she lived with Thomas as basically brother and sister, and that they never were intimate at all. In fact, he wanted nothing to do with her sexually. And she had only signed this marriage contract where it said that they would be platonic because she didn't even know what that meant, and she was too young to know. And the only time the contract was broken was when he gave her that child. That is when she would give a possible motive, because she said that Thomas had said that her and George could be together and that they could remarry after he passed away. And then when he started getting better after getting his teeth pulled, he started saying he wanted to have a sexual relationship with Adelaide, and he wanted to finally be husband and wife. Adelaide said her mind was already set on marrying George and having his children, and she was no longer interested in Thomas because he had never been interested in her. That was also her reasoning for having the chloroform. She would put it on a cloth, put it over his face when he started having these sexual thoughts about her and started trying to act on them. She would make him fall asleep, and that was that. Adelaide said that the night that Thomas died, they were actually arguing because Adelaide confessed to him what she had been doing with the chloroform, and she was feeling so bad about what she was doing that she just couldn't hold it in any longer. And that is when they kind of had to talk about it. Thomas was upset and he went to bed. The next thing she knew, she woke up at 4 a.m. He was dead, and she didn't even think to look to see if Thomas had taken any of this chloroform, drank it himself. She simply threw it away days later because she didn't need it anymore. That was her story, but no one knew if they could believe it. So, could this have been suicide? by a man who was no longer wanted by his wife? Well, Thomas's father, Edwin Sr., was not having this theory. He demanded an inquest to be held because he truly believed this was murder. Both Adelaide and her ex-lover, George, would be arrested. George was charged with being an accessory to murder, but these charges would actually be dropped when they wanted to use him as a star witness in Adelaide's trial, and he was more than willing to talk about what she had made him do and his thoughts on it all. Adelaide, on the other hand, no one ever knew when she was telling the truth. Many of her friends said she was really good at coming up with stories and lying and hiding her real life. She was good at manipulation and making you feel like she was the victim instead of the monster. Now, remember when I told you about Adelaide's wealthy father, who was some human that never wanted to be named? He would end up helping her with the fees of this trial, getting her the best lawyer that money could buy. April 13th, 1886, the trial started and George was on the stand to tell his story. He said that he had no idea what Adelaide's plan was. They didn't have a secret understanding, and that he did throw away his bottles of chloroform that he had, but only because it was in a mindless panic, not for deception. Annie Walker then took the stand, who was Adelaide's nurse. And she would have an interesting fact. She would say that Adelaide had told her that she had gotten pregnant the one time her and her husband hadn't used protection or a condom. But not that that was the first time they had had sex. It was thought by Annie that they were always having sexual relations, but this was the first time that they had done it unprotected. So this showed a crack in Adelaide's story, a big one. And condoms were also found in Thomas's belongings, and he wasn't said to have any other females or males in his life romantically. Now the only problem was proving that there was a way that Thomas could have possibly been murdered, even though there was seemingly no way this chloroform could have been in his stomach. And yet it was. The prosecution would say that possibly Adelaide had knocked him out with just a small dose of chloroform and then poured it down his throat. However, pouring it down his throat would just cause the burning and the blisters to be worse unless some sort of tiny tube was used where it didn't touch his throat at all, which could have still been possible, but at this point, chloroform poisoning was not even a known thing that would kill somebody. So how would she have even known to do this to kill him, or to use a small tube so it didn't burn his throat? They then said if Thomas had accidentally picked up this chloroform bottle in the middle of the night thinking it was a drink and decided to drink it, that it would have burned so badly he wouldn't have been able to drink that much that it would kill him. He would have stopped before he could have poisoned himself. And many said he wouldn't have continued to drink to take his own life because that just wasn't like him. The defense used Thomas's hypochondria as a means for suicide, saying that he was already believing that he was dying. Maybe he just wanted it to end. He was already thinking of it anyway. Or that possibly he was heartbroken about his wife not wanting him anymore. And that is when the defense would bring two witnesses who were doctors, known doctors, to the stand. They would confirm that no one had yet died of chloroform poisoning, and that also if Adelaide had shoved it down his throat in any way, it could have gone down his windpipe, and this would have shown, it would have caused him to basically drown and gag and throw up, and there was no sign of him puking at all. The only option they believed was that Thomas had ingested this himself willingly, and that he had done it so quickly that it actually hadn't touched his throat. This is the only way they could find that this would even be possible. 6 days later, the jury would come back deciding that they had considered the evidence and had found that there was considerable evidence against the prisoner. However, they could not say for sure who had administered the poison. So she was found not guilty. Many still believe that Adelaide had wanted to marry George and wanted to get rid of her husband and stop dealing with him because he wasn't dying fast enough. The courtroom applauded after her sentencing, and a famous doctor, Sir James Paget, would say, "Now that she has been acquitted for murder and cannot be tried again, she should tell us in the interest of science how she did it." Adelaide would not talk, and in fact, she would vanish after this. There were 17 men in the courtroom who had proposed to her after this, a possible murderer, And just like in the Ted Bundy case, these men were falling all over the possible killer. But no one knows what happened to her after this. We do know that Dr. Leach moved to Australia and would pass away 6 years later while on the job. He was investigating the cause of a patient's infection that had a thick covering in the back of her throat, and he inhaled sewer gas and actually passed away. George would move on to America, where he would change his name to John Bernard Walker, and he had married a socialite and written a book about the Titanic. Now, some theories have been found since all of this happened, and one included a 1994 medical article that said it was possible that due to Thomas having a dentist appointment that day, that his mouth was already burning, it was on fire, and it was uncomfortable. So when he started to drink the chloroform, he didn't even feel it at all, so he continued to drink in one go, and this caused his throat not to burn, and he didn't know he was drinking the wrong glass. There was another theory found in a book called Poison and Adelaide Bartlett, and it basically said that there was a conversation that Thomas had had with Dr. Leach a week prior to his death. Thomas started saying that George was a hypnotist and that he mesmerized Thomas through his wife. Now, Adelaide at this point stopped Thomas from talking to Dr. Leach and basically said that everything he was saying was absurd. But Thomas continued talking and basically saying that he was in a mesmeric influence that was forcing him to do strange things. And the doctor just simply said that he was experiencing delusions and they should hopefully go away soon, taking Adelaide's side. But was there more to this? Was this actually true? The author of this book theorized that possibly Thomas was being hypnotized, but by Adelaide, and that this was what was causing him to always feel ill. And because he had this hypochondria, it was like a boy crying wolf. He had already said he had all these illnesses, so no one believed him when he really was under this weird influence of her hypnosis, and that he was in a hypnotic state when he chugged this chloroform and brandy without feeling anything. The author also believed that when Thomas had been found with mercury poisoning, that was actually also from Adelaide, who was trying to poison him with lead, but when this was found out, she had to change it to chloroform. The book, The Pimlico Mystery, actually said that it was quite simple, that they believed that it was New Year's Eve, and when his wife offered him a drink to drink at midnight, Thomas simply took it and gulped it down in seconds, not knowing or not wanting to think that his wife could be his killer. What do you believe happened to him? Was she guilty? Was it a freak accident? And how did that poison get in his stomach without any way of it getting there? Without any sign of it being anywhere else in his body first. I used to do a ton of these vintage cases, and I think that they're so interesting to me because back in that time, there were not as many tests you could do, and there weren't as many tools that you had at your disposal to be able to figure out these crimes. And I do wonder if cases like this would be easily solved today. But back then it was such a mystery because how is this possible? So with the knowledge we have today, what do you believe happened? Because I am seriously baffled at this one. I do want to say that it's possible that he had been so heartbroken that he drank it himself, but there's also a good chance that he did not know what he was ingesting that night. I'd also really love to know what happened to Adelaide Bartlett, where she went, what she did, and who else she possibly killed. But that is all for today. If you enjoy these, please make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss when I upload next, because I upload literally all the time. But don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay. Bye. Oh, my remote. Bye.